2 seconds before live stream hits.
Dan, can you guys hear me?
And then close that. Sean. Minimize this. Just close the YouTube, the actual YouTube. The page you have open, close it.
Taylor's trying to talk.
Yeah, you guys can't hear me.
We can hear him.
X out of.
Yes,
tab.
do that. Yes,
Yeah.
click it. Perfect. Okay.
Down.
And actually, you can close that too.
Yeah.
Just close up, yeah, close all of it. And then let's go ahead and share the presentation.
Should we make sure we can hear Taylor though?
You guys,
Taylor, go ahead
We
again.
heard you, but very.
yeah, I'm talking. Can you hear me?
Do
Yeah, a little bit.
volume on the, there you go.
Hello, testing.
All right.
We got you. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you guys fine. I'm
Perfect.
just asking, Dan, are you back on duty for this?
Are you back on something? You're cutting out.
No, I came to say my goodbyes.
Oh, okay.
Do an official hand, pass the baton.
Yeah, let's
Part meeting, part wake.
to that point, let's do introductions. You want to start us off and then let's do introductions.
So I was gonna call the planning commission work session for February 25th, 2025 to order. I'll start just an informal roll call. Gene Simpson, planning commission chair.
Dan Vance, planning commissioner. Joe Tillotson, planning commissioner.
And I believe everybody else is staff or liaisons, so we'll go right into introducing our counselor, Stan Key.
Yes, I'm City Councilor Dan Stanke. I was the liaison for the last 2 years, and with recent changes, this is the first meeting since we've had those changes. I am no longer the liaison to the Planning Commission. It's been amazing these last 2 years, and it's kind of weird to say that, but I've learned a lot being a part of this, and I just wanted to come and say goodbye because how much I did enjoy this and working with you, everybody
Cool.
here.
And you're going to the library.
We're doing
Advisory committee, right?
library as well as the school board. I've switched with Taylor Giles here. He'll be your new liaison. And some of you might remember him from being on the planning commission.
You're back.
Well, Dan, it's been a pleasure serving with you, and I appreciate all your input and your representation of our concerns, taking them straight up to council. That's been a very good communication vehicle that I've enjoyed. Thank you.
Yeah, tree codes on the goals for this year. So it's happening.
All right. Rock and roll.
And hello, I think I've met many of you. Not a lot of the same faces from when I was on the planning commission, except,
Hold on.
oh,
Go.
hello.
Yeah, sorry, go again.
Okay, so I'm Taylor Giles. I'm on city council. A lot of new faces from when I was on the planning commission, but then I also did a year as a council liaison to planning commission. I think Dan and Gene might have been the only two that were on back then, but I am excited to be back involved with the planning commission, mainly because there's so much work to be done in Sherwood West and the Brookman extension and all of it. Like, I just wanted to make sure that the communication is happening. And it's not that I didn't have faith in Dan being able to do it. One of the things that I'm very passionate about is using AI to help us do meeting notes and to be able to communicate out simply the work the planning commission does, because it is so important and it's so misunderstood. And so I am all for feedback and trying to figure out how to convey the very complicated things that you guys deal with to the general public in ways that are understandable, because it is, I've been involved with the planning commission like 4.5 years, and I still need to have things simplified a bit, because it's like, I'm like that now. I know there's a law that says something about something, and so that's where Gene comes in and the staff there, the city. So anyway, thrilled to be here.
Thank you very much. And then did we want to go around and do staff introductions now? Thank you. Eric, you want to?
Eric Rutledge, CD director. Thanks.
We got
Colleen Rush, planning coordinator. Chelsea Rodriguez, law clerk.
Sebastian Tapia, interim city attorney.
Eric Adair, Economic Development Manager.
Hugo Osta, Associate Planner.
Sean Conrad, Planning Manager.
And I'm Carrie Richter. I am the Land Use Council, the on-call special land use council for the city.
excellent. We are outnumbered by staff tonight for sure. So
Nice. Well, I want to just, maybe I can just kick us off. Thank you guys.
Yeah.
It's been like, it's really great to see the attendance tonight from council and from staff. You know, we have, for Carrie's sort of background, we have some new staff that are getting into local government. Eric's coming from the business side. That's why we recruited him. So we got to get him up to speed on all things land use. Great to have the city attorney here as well. So thank you for all the interest. I think it would be, so we do training annually, so this is kind of the annual training. And really it's for you on the planning commission. As we get into all sorts of projects, we're gonna get busy again. So we just wanna sort of touch base and get ready for that. What I'd like to do, and I apologize, I didn't give you guys a heads up, so you don't have to have anything, but it might be good before we start for each counselor or for each commissioner to just, if there's anything top of mind that you really want to try and get out of this training, let us know now. And hopefully Carrie can cover it either as part of the presentation, or if it's not part, we can circle back to it and be sure to touch base on it if we can. So, why don't we do that? Gene, anything you want to get out of this particularly?
not just making sure that we are really clear about ex parte contact disclosures, reply alls as like the quasi meetings, and the other part of it would be that whole part of it of how we operate in a meeting. And then if we have a quasi judicial meeting and we get our staff report and we don't agree with it, what's best practices? I mean, I have my thoughts, but I'd like to hear from legal and from staff. How do we articulate to you that we don't agree with the staff report? And what do we have to present to staff to be able to make better findings, different findings, or a different answer? So.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would actually kind of echo some of that. I think ex parte contact is always one that is confusing. And in the time that I've been here, I think I've almost kind of felt like, oh, maybe it's this way or it's this way a couple times. And so getting that more clear is always better. But otherwise, yeah, I concur with her thoughts.
Cool. Great. And why don't we actually, Dan, let's ask the counselors as well. Dan, you have anything you want to get out of this? You're not? Just goodbye. Seriously?
Yeah.
All right, you're done. All right, I'm kidding. Good to have you though.
But I would say the conflict of interest, the ex parte contact is the most common thing that I have heard over the last 2 years being brought up, like, is this it or is it not? And I think people are wanting to be extra cautious because of the legality of it, which is understandable, so.
Cool. Are you really leaving?
I really am.
Okay.
So, okay.
Wasn't sure. You're so sarcastic so many times that like it's like. See you, Dan. Thanks.
I think just to elaborate slightly on what Gene was already saying, I've only been part of one quasi judicial meeting so far, so I'm very much a rookie. And I had the same question of when I'm reading a staff report, when I've got a question, often I have several questions and I don't know how much time I should take versus just go to the meeting and hear what everybody has to say. And part of it is not understanding to what degree can I talk about things prior to the meeting, even with staff. You know, in a perfect open world, I would just talk to anybody about my questions, but I understand I can't do that. And then just to give a very specific example of the one meeting I went to, in the staff report, there was one place where we mentioned you can have this, you know, you're going to need to provide this many parking spots in your new parking lot. And the person from the applicant was providing their input their presentation and everything was going along fine, and we got to one place where no, we're gonna have this many parking spaces, and I'm holding my finger and thumb here, you know, whatever the number is. And well, the staff report says you have to have this many, no, we're doing this many. And I felt like standing up and going, well, what do you do? I mean, do you turn down the whole thing because of that small of an issue out of a 500-page, you know, thing? And so fortunately, other people kind of I think you, Dan, kind of raised that question. And we talked about it but I remember thinking at the time, I certainly wouldn't want to turn something down for a few parking spaces, but what qualifies as too big of a discrepancy?
Like materiality thresholds.
Yeah.
Criteria, standards.
Counselor Giles?
Yeah, I think that, by the way, I struggle with that same stuff of when can you talk about stuff, you know, and when you can't. I would say,
Hold on, Taylor.
Go ahead.
I just want to know who keeps turning me down. So, okay, I can mute myself when I'm not talking. I wanted to hear, I struggle with that same thing about who can you talk to and when, and sometimes it's just like I have a simple question. The answer is you can usually talk to Gene, and then you can always talk to the lawyer and staff, right, about questions. And so that's the simple answer that I've learned now. It's taken me a long time to learn it, but part of that is you know, yeah, using your best judgment. And I would love to hear in this training session about how you get up to speed and maybe how some people prep for the meetings. You know, there's a tremendous amount of reading and stuff that planning commissioners have to do. And so maybe just some tips and tricks on how to get through that with all, you know, we're all volunteers. So just how do we make it easy for us to understand the crucial details, right?
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for, you want me to go? Thank you.
Sorry, one sec. Let's share your presentation and let's go.
Yeah.
So thank you for the opportunity to talk. I'm gonna keep this to less than an hour. I said this last night in Oregon City and I was at an hour and 10 minutes. So I'm gonna try to move along and focus on your questions. I have about 15 slides. I know many of you know much of this, but my goal is to sort of teach you all at least one thing you didn't know before walking in. So I'm gonna try to cover the world of land use, but I'm gonna go deep on a couple of things that I think might be of interest to you, changes in the law, things like that. So,
Would you like the keyboard?
sure, that's fine. Do I just push forward?
Yeah, you push forward down.
Oh, cool. Okay. So you probably all know this already. The Oregon Land Use Planning Framework is made up of different levels, different layers. And the city has an obligation to implement all the layers. And the purpose of the system is to achieve a variety of competitive and complementary goals, right? We're trying to further livability. We're trying to further economic development. We're trying to protect resources. We're trying to provide for the orderly and efficient use of land. And we do that by complying with all of these different layers of regulation. The US Constitution being the baseline, state regulations, including the Oregon Revised Statutes, which set forth certain land use procedures that we have to comply with, special laws that we have to implement, like housing protections. Then there are administrative rules that are implemented by a land use agency called the Land Conservation and Development Commission, and they're in Salem. And they have promulgated rules, including statewide land use goals, 1 through 19. There are other LCDC rules that implement the goals. There are administrative rules that apply to ODOT, and there are, that's the Oregon Department of Transportation and DSL, Department of State Lands. So the city has to comply with all of those state requirements. Then you know Sherwood is part of Metro, one of the 24 cities within Metro. And Metro has, sets the urban growth boundary. So they are the organization charged with identifying where we are going to protect farmland and outside the urban growth boundary and where we're going to develop over a planning horizon. So Metro has the urban growth management functional plan, which are regulations that the city has to comply with when it annexes and plans for growth consistent with Metro requirements. And all of those get implemented in the city of Sherwood through the Sherwood Comprehensive Plan, which is essentially the constitution for the city when it comes to land use. It is the 20-year projection of how the city sees it, what it wants to be in the over a 20-year horizon. And it deals with not just zoning questions, it deals with infrastructure, it does with master planning for transportation facilities and sewer pipes and water lines. It deals with health and safety issues. It deals with goal 5 related issues, which are the livability related issues like wetlands and natural resources. All of those objectives are set forth in the comprehensive plan. And then those comprehensive plan policies are implemented with the Sherwood Municipal Code, Title 16, and the Sherwood Plan and Zoning Map. And so when you review an application for development, in most cases, the standards and criteria that you're reviewing are set forth in the municipal code. All of that municipal code has been drafted to implement all the things that come before it. So whenever you're amending your municipal code or your comprehensive plan, we have to look at go back and evaluate the goals and make sure we remain in compliance so that the whole system remains consistent.
Probably gotta click on that thing again, get it loaded.
I didn't realize our,
Anywhere on there.
I didn't realize our statewide land use goals were OAR, not ORS. That's interesting.
Yes, they are implemented by LCDC.
Okay, so they could be changed by administrative rule,
They could.
not by the legislature.
They could.
Fascinating.
But they are very rarely changed. There has been a push for a long time to have a goal 20 that would be a climate change goal, and it hasn't gained traction. Some people say it's because there's another goal about health hazards that covers it, but it just, for some reason, they don't change very often. But they could. Okay.
You should be good.
All right. There's two different, excuse me, there's two different types of decision-making that you will be charged with as a planning commission. Long-range planning and quasi-judicial planning. Long-range planning is legislative decision-making. Legislative decision-making is when I said you're amending your comprehensive plan, right? These are generally city-initiated efforts. They involve the adoption of regulations and policies applicable to citywide or to a specific geography. Generally, the planning commission makes a recommendation to the city council about what needs to be changed in the code, and then the city council makes final decision. These kinds of decisions are political, right? Is it a good idea? They're policy making, and as a result, they don't require such strict procedural requirements. For example, there's no ex parte contact limitations with legislative decision making because you're supposed to be out talking with your constituents about what the policy should be. There are no bias. You're supposed to be biased. You're supposed to feel strongly about one thing or another and want to implement it in city policy. The only procedural limitation for legislative decision-making has to do with conflict of interest, and conflict of interest is when you have a pecuniary interest in the outcome. So if you own property and could stand to make a lot of money by an upzoning, you might have a conflict of interest and would need to remove yourself for that reason. So that's legislative decision-making. The other type is quasi-judicial or administrative. And quasi-judicial decision-making, the focus is on the judicial. You're acting as a judge to determine compliance with applicable requirements. So these are generally applicant initiated as opposed to city initiated. You're reviewing a proposal to determine if it meets the criteria. So you're not making policy, you're adjudicating an application. Planning Commission is the final decision maker unless the decision is appealed, and we follow a formal quasi-judicial procedure that is set forth in state law. So the local land use review categories in Sherwood there are 4 types of quasi-judicial decision-making. And the reason there are 4 types is because they reflect the difference in the amount of discretion associated with the decision. So administrative decisions or type 1 decisions are decisions where there's no discretionary decision-making. So these are lot line adjustments, final plats, home occupations, building permits, right? You come in with your building permit plans. And Sean just checks a box that says the house is 35 feet, tall, and it's 10 feet from the street, so it meets the setbacks. And it has the garage in the right place, access is the right, it's consistent with the code. So these are all set forth in clear and objective standards that are check the box determinations that planning staff makes. There's no notice and there's no hearing and there's no right to appeal. Quasi-judicial decisions are type 2 through type 4. Type 2 decisions are what we call limited land use decisions. They are land divisions and design review. And the obligation to process them as limited land use decisions, or what the city calls type 2, is set forth in state law. We don't have a choice. We have to follow the limited land use procedures when it comes to land divisions and design review. And that limited land use procedure set out in state law, that is also set out in the city's code, says that the community development director makes the initial decision with an appeal to the planning commission. There is notice to neighbors, and the neighbors have an opportunity to provide written comment. After the director makes a decision, there are appeal rights to the planning commission. So that's what a limited land use decision is. Type 3 decisions are sort of, as I usually think of them, the bread and butter of what the planning commission usually hears. These are conditional use decisions, large lot subdivisions, or greater than 40,000 square foot plan review. The hearings officer reviews these decisions with an appeal to the city commission, to the planning commission. This is discretionary review to determine compliance with the criteria, and generally these criteria are the most discretionary. These are criteria like the conditional use is compatible or it's appropriate. These kinds of highly discretionary terms that require interpretation and application of policy judgment. Type 4 decisions are 50+ lot subdivisions, large site plan reviews, map or text amendments. And when I say map or text amendments, these are, a single property wants to rezone. That is a quasi-judicial map amendment, as opposed to a legislative decision that would say rezone a whole concept plan area. These include notice, public hearing by the planning commission with a recommendation and final decision by the city council.
Can I pause you there, Carrie? Go ahead.
Well, kind of a question on that. You said that rezoning or changing zoning is legislative. But we've had cases where we have applicants come in and want rezoning and a change to something or other that would qualify as quasi-judicial. So what is that considered and how do we treat it?
How do we decide? When there is a combination of legislative and quasi-judicial, we usually, my recommendation is usually to treat it as quasi-judicial. And the reason why is because quasi-judicial carries more procedures. You never get in trouble for doing too many procedures. You get in trouble for not doing enough, right? So I always err on the side of over proceduring rather than under proceduring.
The decision maker would still be at the top of that list, which would be city council. They're just using quasi judicial procedures as the council.
Okay.
And Dan, you asked me recently, like, so we had a projects in the Cedar Creek Plaza development, and you guys heard and actually denied an apartment building there. And now there's a building going up and you guys haven't looked at it. And that's the answer, is that when they did the apartment building, it was over 40,000. So it came to you guys, but what they're proposing now is like 10,000 or something. And so it was just done by staff. So same property, same zone, you know, just different proposal went to a different body because of the size.
Example.
Sorry, Joe, do you have something?
Just really quickly on the type 4, you know, the zoning map amendments corresponds with the title, site plan review map or text amendment. What text amendment is that? Text amendment of what?
Let's say that I am an industrial user and the code says that outdoor storage has to be only that outdoor storage in this particular area is not allowed. And I want to change that.
Okay.
So it would be a very limited scope text amendment,
Text of city code.
text of
Amendment.
city code amendment, but it would be
For that
very
particular
small
case.
for that particular case or for that particular area.
That sounds like corresponds to the example of your question.
Is it, yeah, whether it's legislative or quasi judicial.
So it's not a bright line rule. It's a decision that is based on the legal answer is there's 4 factors that the courts use to determine if something's legislative or quasi judicial. And those factors are whether or not the decision was filed by a private applicant or a public applicant, whether the decision must result, whether or not the review must result in a decision. Like if it's a code amendment, you all could decide not to move it forward. The third is what size is it? So is it big? Does it affect a lot of people, a lot of owners or not? And does it require the application of policy or the making of policy? And that's you know, you can make arguments on that 4th factor really easily, one way or the other. So it's not a bright line test. But again, if I'm ever faced with confusion, quasi judicial if I'm not sure, quasi judicial is the answer.
You just said private or public applicant. I don't understand what's your between those two.
A private property owner as opposed to a public entity, the city. No, the city.
Okay,
The city, Washington County,
public means government.
public means government.
Okay.
So, is there any way that we could adjust our agenda or something to slap on it some of these definite, like I love that you've broken these out as for the first time been real clear. And I know that it's not a bright line, but it feels like using simple language to say this is this type of decision and the decision maker is hearing officer, right? Or you know what I mean? Like it feels like on our agendas, we could do that to help the public understand why certain things, the biggest complaint I always hear is people say, well, you guys made such a quick decision on that. And it's like, well, we've been looking at it for 6 months and discussing it. And so it's not really, anyway, is that a possibility to adjust our
Issues with that? I mean, just so we
Our
normally
agenda?
have. Yeah, we normally have the agenda item in the project description, but we could add basic info.
Does the notice at the bottom of the page say this notice is, you know, this application will be considered through a type 3 process under the code that will include.
Our public notice does. So Counselor Giles, our public notice that we send out to the neighbors and to, you know, whoever's entitled to it, that, and you probably don't get many of those as a property owner, but that does clearly delineate, you know, here's the hearing date, here's the hearing body, here's the appeal authority. So we do list all that out, but we could add it to the actual, I don't see any issues with adding it to our planning commission agenda. I think that's
Let's make a note and then circle back to it later, so we don't say.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, moving on. Okay, the planning commission decision procedure that I'm gonna focus on tonight is the quasi judicial procedure, because we talked about that's where you can get, you can make mistakes, and if you make mistakes, you go to Luba and Luba remands the decision for you to do it again. So we try to avoid making mistakes, so we don't have to go to Luba and go around again. So I'm gonna talk through many of these things, these are set by state law and the code says that you that all planning commission decisions are started through a pre-application meeting with staff and a neighborhood meeting. An application is filed and completeness review happens. City staff has 30 days to conduct a completeness review. Completeness review is not a determination that the criteria that are applicable to the application are satisfied. Completeness review is whether or not the application includes all the things that it needs to include under the code. And oftentimes the code says an application for a conditional use will include a site plan, a grading plan, elevation drawings, a survey, signature of the owner, all of that list of things. So when Eric gets an application, he just looks through, does there a grading plan? Check the box. Is there a survey? Check the box. Does a signature on the application? Check the box. So completeness review sometimes does include sort of an evaluation of, well, is there a narrative that responds to the criteria? But the substance of that narrative, whether or not it's adequate, is not determined at completeness. So staff has 30 days to let an applicant know that either their application is complete when it's filed, the note to let an applicant know that their application is incomplete, and then an applicant has 180 days to provide additional information that is identified in the incompleteness notice, or the applicant can order the city to deem it complete. In other words, I'm not going to provide anything, deem it complete. That completeness determination is really important because that's what starts the clock for the city to make a final decision. The city has 120 days from the date of completeness to make a final decision. If an applicant does not respond to the city within 180 days, either saying, I'm not giving you what you want and I deem it complete, or does provide the information, on the 181st day, the application is void. That happens by operation of law. The other thing that's important about completeness review and this time law and this schedule is that if an application is deemed complete within 180 days, the fixed goalpost rule applies. And the fixed goalpost rule says that the criteria and standards that apply to an application are determined at the time the application is filed, assuming that an applicant proceeds with completing their application in 180 days. So if the city were to change the code in the time between when the application is filed and when it is processed, those changes will not apply. It's interesting to note that there's a bill in the legislature right now that would let an applicant for housing decide which criteria and standards it wants to use. An interesting question in my mind is whether or not they can cherry pick. I want this one, I don't want this one, I'll go, 2025 on this one, and I'll go 2023 on this one, could be a real mishmash and could create a lot of confusion, so.
Cherry pick from what? Just any
Which
prior
code?
version
Which
of our.
code?
Which code?
Which code instance? So it would have to be our code at any time in history?
No, it would be our code at any time during the time the application is pending.
So they.
So it wouldn't be like 1938,
I see. Guys, got it. I got it.
but it still would be a lot of confusion, I think, theoretically. You got a tree code in the interim.
But do they just get to choose once then? If this bill that's going through, they get one choice. They say, we wanted to apply to
Well,
this
I'm
date.
Sure,
Oh,
I'm not sure. Like, do you get to say, I'll take subsection A and from over here and subsection B from
Oh,
over
okay.
here and subsection D from over here.
Yeah.
Um.
Hmm.
Okay. Question?
Luba is at Land Use Board of Appeals.
It is. Land Use Board of Appeals is the state agency charged with exclusive jurisdiction to hear all appeals on land use issues. And they are a 3-member body of lawyers in Salem whose only job is to hear land use appeals,
Who are they appointed by?
the governor.
Sure.
And they sit for 4-year terms. They hear between 300 and 500 appeals a year. Before the Great Recession in like 2009, 2010, they heard like 700 to 800, 900 a year, and there's 3 people, 1 staff attorney. So it's a big job.
Can either a city or an applicant appeal, or is it just applicants who can appeal?
Any party to a proceeding can appeal. So if you are a participant, whether you're an opponent or a proponent or the applicant, or usually the city doesn't appeal because they're the decision maker. But oftentimes the city participates on defending the decision that is being challenged. All decisions can be appealed unless state law says you can't appeal it. And there are some circumstances where, in the housing context, where there are decisions that cannot be appealed.
Are they primarily looking at procedures to make sure they were all followed, or? can
Luba?
Appeals, yeah, or can appeals result in different subjective decisions too? In such cases?
There are a number of things that Luba has jurisdiction to consider. In addition to compliance with state law and local codes with respect to procedures, there are substantive standards. For example, did the city interpret the code accurately? Are there adequate findings to explain the decision, to explain which evidence, and is there evidence on which a reasonable person could believe that the criteria are satisfied?
What's our track record with Luba?
Pretty good since we hired Carrie.
You lost a Luba appeal with me at the helm, but you haven't had very many.
No, we haven't. You guys were involved in that. You guys heard, well, two of your decisions recent, within the last 2-3 years or so were appealed to city council. Then they were appealed to Luba, and Luba affirmed the city council decision on those. Prior to that, I don't know, but I assume fairly good, if we're doing things the right way. Yeah. Cool.
Okay, so you know that at the beginning of a quasi-judicial hearing, there is a script that you read, or
Staff now reads, thank goodness.
fascinating, riveting. You know, I think about, these people who come to these meetings and they've never been to a public meeting before, and we just start them out with this, all the rules. And the rules are really important. They're really important. And they say things like, staff report has been made available 7 days in advance. They say that this is going to be a public hearing, and they give instructions about how to provide testimony and how to submit evidence into the record. Another really important factor is raise it or waive it. That's part of the script. Raise it or waive it is essential to the land use procedures, because a participant has got to point out their objection as soon as they can, so that it gives the local government an opportunity to respond. It flushes out that I'll hide in the weeds with my arguments until I get to the last hearing before city council, and I'm gonna throw it all on them, and then they'll be taken aback and they'll rule in my favor. Raise it or waive it exists throughout every step of the way, and Luba will not consider an issue that wasn't raised. In fact, I did a Court of Appeals oral argument this morning and it was all about raise it or waive it. So it's a really important issue. And it really helps facilitate the resolution of issues early. The script says that the failure to raise constitutional issues precludes an action for damages in circuit court. Oftentimes people don't know what that means. That means that if someone were to challenge the city for a condition of approval that requires them to make improvements, what we call an exaction. If we imposed an exaction and a person wants to go to circuit court and argue that this was a taking under the Fifth Amendment, they have to raise that challenge before the planning commission or the city council before they can go to circuit court, for the same reason that you have to raise things before you go to LUBA. It's an opportunity for the city to modify its position because it will know about the concern. At the initial evidentiary hearing, every party has a right to a continuance. But that only exists at the initial evidentiary hearing. So if the planning commission is always the appellate body, then that will never be the initial evidentiary. Well, I guess in a type 2, right? The planning commission would be the initial evidentiary hearing.
Yes. Type 2 would get, are you talking on appeal?
Mhm.
Yeah, type 2 would get appealed to planning commission, and then that would be the initial.
Type 3.
Type 3 would be hearings officer would be the initial, and
Type 4,
yeah,
get the first hearing.
Okay, so my point is, it's the initial evidentiary hearing that people have, any person who makes the request can is entitled to a continuance. But after that first hearing, you don't have a right to a continuance.
Even if they're not a named party in the action, so they can just be somebody who shows up.
Anybody who shows up can request a continuance at the first hearing.
And how long do you have to continue it?
To a date certain,
So it could be the next meeting.
could be the next meeting.
Okay.
And in fact, with the 120-day deadline to get to a final decision, it may make sense to expedite it. Because you gotta think about, not only does it have to get through you, it has to get through the city council too. So you want to be able to keep it moving.
Oh, yeah.
So what happens if we're up against the clock and somebody in the audience makes that request, but it puts us over 120-day? What happens in that
That's
case?
failure by, sorry,
Well,
staff,
yeah,
but it's a failure by
I'm
staff.
Guessing that case, but I'm just curious.
What would we do or what happens?
What happens is what I'm curious about.
Well, what we would do if we came into that situation is we would call a special meeting for the next day in order to get it done in 120 days. If you don't make a decision within 120 days, the applicant who controls the timeline has a right to go to circuit court and ask a judge to order the city to approve the application. That procedure is called a writ of mandamus. And the downside of a writ of mandamus for the city is that if a applicant prevails in circuit court, the judge will order the city to pay attorney's fees.
And Home Depot gets built without oversight by staff.
I see.
we've had a writ of mandamus here. Yes.
This year we did?
No,
No,
but
but
Home
many,
Depot.
many years ago, the Home
The Home
Depot
Depot
was
was
built under writ of mandamus, and none of the staff here were
Yeah,
present at the time, just to clarify. But it's, you know, rest assured that Hugo and Sean and I at times, you know, it is a difficult part of the job for the planner to look at the schedule and try and look at, because you guys only meet once every, you know, twice a month. City council only meets twice a month. And so, and then you bring in public notice requirements with like the newspaper and their publishing schedule. There, just in terms of the timeline alone, there's a newspaper, which we may crack over. That's another topic, but we may crack open the public notice requirements. But the planner's got to bring all that together,
plus having the materials ready 7 days prior to the meeting.
and we got to look at all of that. And then we also have to, even the non-controversial applications, we have to assume that it's going to be appealed. You have to assume it. We always do. We assume it's going to be appealed to whatever body, and we work that into the schedule.
What was the term? Like, we mentioned Home Depot was built.
Writ of mandate.
Writ of mandamus, WRIT, writ.
So the appeal has to happen within 120 days too?
The whole enchilada.
I know,
Final,
but not
final
mandamus.
city decision.
It could be appealed to LUBA after. 120. Right.
Well, after the city makes final decision, then you have 21 days to appeal that to LUBA. But that's outside the 120 days. That's a different timeline.
So on the failure to raise constitutional issues, if an applicant is in front of us and says, I think that the number of trees I'm being asked to plant is an exaction. As a planning commissioner in the middle of a hearing, how do we rectify that? Because we don't, or actually, maybe that's not a good one, because we could count trees, but we don't know if the SDCs being charged by the city and Washington County are fair. How do we address that? Because we've had people come to us before hearings and say, do you realize how much it costs me to do this application? You know, no, I
Well,
don't know what SDCs are. They're not
Yeah.
part of what we
well, I
look at,
think,
and how do
I
we
think
address that?
the answer is that that's not part of the standards and criteria that are relevant to this application. We only do what we do. This is our purview. And our purview is to review land use applications and not, that's a question for city staff. Or the city council.
Okay.
So in other words, if the applicant made such a claim, it would have to be outside of this process.
Yeah, I think that the types of constitutional claims that I'm talking about are the obligations to build road frontage improvements that are imposed as a condition, right? And an applicant says that they're not roughly proportional to the impacts of my development. And then the staff's job, public works job, will be to come back and explain to you why they are proportional.
Okay, so we would expect to see a rough proportionality calculation
Right.
if it was raised at the hearing.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, so we have this continuance, right? The applicant bears the burden of proof, so they, because they bear the burden of proof, they get to go first and they get to go last, so they have a right to rebuttal. Either at the end of the hearing before the record closes. Or that rebuttal can take the form of a writing. Once you have heard from all the people that want to testify, the record closes, you all deliberate and make a decision, and then there's a right to appeal. I think I covered everything in this slide. The applicant controls the 120-day deadline. So back to your question about what if we're almost there and there's an appeal, what do we do? Oftentimes there'll be conversations between city staff and the applicant about extending that timeline. So that timeline can be extended at the applicant's request as long as the applicant agrees in writing. So for example, at a meeting, maybe the applicant says, I'd like to have a continuance in order to provide final written argument, or I'd like to have an opportunity to provide some more written testimony. And the response to that would be, where are we in the 120-day clock?
I always ask for a tolling of it.
Yeah, and then if there's not enough time, then the question to the applicant is, would you be willing to extend the 120-day clock? And they say yes for 30 days. And then you say, will you send that in writing to and email the staff? So we'll have that right. The other alternative other than a continuance is called an open record period. And this is where after a hearing, a public hearing, you leave the record open for a certain number of days to allow the submittal of written testimony rather than having a continued hearing. And the state law allows for this 777 period where you have first 7 days, anyone can submit anything. Second 7 days, people can respond to the things that were submitted in the first 7 days. And then the last 7 days is for final written argument by the applicant. In my experience, cities don't usually use the 777 period because 21 days is longer than it takes before your next meeting. And so it's additional time. Jurisdictions that I see that use the 777 are those that have hearings officers where they don't want to pay the hearings officer to come back for a second meeting. But volunteers, they're more than happy. So like, Multnomah County, for example, Washington County that uses hearings officers, they use the 777 all the time because they only want to have one hearing. I just want you to know that that's an alternative, that sometimes you'll hear people say, can we leave the record open for written materials? And that's what the process is under state law.
Does it have to be 7, 7, and 7?
Has to be at least 7
At each.
phase. So it can't be 2.
We have used that here for you guys, we used that here, actually, we used it for Sherwood Commerce Center Phase 1. And I think it was because the applicant was willing to toll the 120 days. And they told the 120 days and then we went into the 777, so it gave us enough time to go to come.
I like the 777 because it gives everybody an opportunity to sort of like say their last piece in writing.
Yeah.
When you continue a hearing, you're kind of, you're in a surprise situation at the continued hearing about what will happen.
Yeah.
So it doesn't allow the decision makers much time to prepare.
Yeah, we did a lot to get that many applications. There were a lot of moving parts and a lot of applications going on and a lot of 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock and
1 o'clock.
really late night meetings trying to get all our applications through.
Okay, so,
Oh,
It's like 1:15 for one of those.
okay, well, it's gonna be 1:15 if I don't get moving. So, participant roles and responsibilities, I'm not gonna go through all of this, but what I think is important for you to understand is that every perspective has a different role to play. And what's really important about this is that the applicant bears the burden of proof. They are the ones who have to produce the evidence to show you that the criteria are satisfied. It is not the opponent's job to show you that the criteria are not satisfied. It is the applicant's burden throughout the process. So if the evidence is deficient, it's on the applicant. The opponents are going to try to say that the evidence is deficient, or that it's not reliable. But at the end of the day, the burden rests with the applicant all the time. It doesn't switch as it does in some kinds of court cases. All right. Right to an impartial tribunal. So decisions have to be based on the testimony and evidence that is part of the record. So that means you can't make a decision on things that are not in the record. And the record is all the pieces of paper that are submitted during the review. The record is the recordings of all the public hearings. Those are things that are in the record. And it's important that the public record is formally maintained so that we know exactly what documents went into making a decision. When we take cases to LUBA, LUBA doesn't take evidence. They look only at the record. So what's in the record, what's out of the record, is critical to the success of a LUBA appeal. That we're clear about that, or we can fight about the record contents for months at LUBA sometimes. So we want to be clear about what's in the record. We want to take things into the record, and we want to be generous about including things in the record. And so because we want people to have the opportunity to respond to what's in the record, which is going to be what we're going to use to make our decision. So that's why we have limitation on ex parte contacts. Ex parte contacts are contacts that happen outside of the public record. They are conversations you might have with someone in a grocery store about why this application is a terrible idea. They are newspaper reports that you might read online about the project. They are neighborhood meetings where the topic is discussed, social media blogs, site visits and conversations with the public, Another one is your personal or professional experience. Many of you as planning commissioners have particular expertise in architecture or in design or in geology. And it's important that if you think that that is going to come to bear on your review, that you make those perspectives known during the time at the beginning of the hearing where we disclose all of our ex parte contacts. Ex parte contacts are not prohibited, they're expected. That's why we have a time at the beginning of the hearing for everyone to disclose them all. The easiest way to cure a ex parte contact is for you to put the substance of that contact into the record. So if you read a blog and it happens to talk about the project for an application that is before you, you send the copy of the blog to Hugo and he puts it in the record. It's that simple. Newspaper article puts in the record. Social media post goes in the record. And then when the time comes up to talk about it, you say, I read this newspaper article and I sent it to Hugo and Hugo put it in the record.
Seems like since LUBA doesn't consider evidence, only what's in the record, it seems like that's advantageous to cities and not to applicants. In other words, an applicant could say, well, that should be in the record. And the city can say it's not. Is that a common complaint or not really?
The rules about records, everything that's in the record are things that are submitted with the request to be in the record. And the legal definition of everything in the record is everything that is taken in by the final decision maker and not rejected by the final decision maker. So as a practical matter, the record is everything that staff sends along. And if an applicant, it turns out, submitted a letter from when the matter was before the planning commission and we're at LUBA, they will say, I submitted a letter before the planning commission, and then we go back and find it and we add it to the record. I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's how it works as a practical matter.
Did I hear you say that our professional expertise is considered ex parte contact?
It is if it's gonna influence your decision. And it's not really an ex parte contact. It's more of evidence that you're going to use, right? When you look at it, say you're a geotech engineer and you look at a grading plan and you see that the topo numbers are wrong, or that the grading is wrong because of your expertise as an engineer. You have an obligation to put those and those are legitimate things. I mean, we brought you on to the planning commission because you have particular expertise. But the thing to do is to disclose that during the time for ex parte contacts so that everyone knows about it and has an opportunity to respond.
And the applicant has an opportunity to, or somebody in the room has an opportunity to say, we don't want that person on there or something, or to be involved.
Correct.
What's the criteria for that? Like, what if they say that and we all go, well, that's why they're on here, you know?
Well, so
Yeah.
after we do the ex parte contact disclosures, we do conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest are pecuniary interests, right? If you stand to make money, your kid mows the grass for the church that's gonna get approved, you know, that you might have a pecuniary interest. Or bias, right? And bias is different than ex parte contacts. Bias is I have a personal preference. I have a personal proclivity towards this application because I go to this church, or I can't stand this guy because he cuts me off every, Friday getting to the Dairy Queen, like everybody has biases.
Night for me, for sure.
Everybody has biases, and if you have actual bias that you cannot set aside and make a decision based on the criteria, then you have to recuse yourself from participating. The thing about bias.
Quick question about, before we go too far off of this. Expertise and professional experience does not include city staff, right? So if I talk to them, I mean, assuming I was on planning commission and I talked to them and said, hey, I have a question about this code or this application or whatever, and they give me a reading on it, is that ex parte contact?
It is not.
Okay.
Conversations with city staff are not ex parte contacts. And
Perfect.
And the question came up early on about what's best practice for talking with staff as much as you can.
Yeah,
That's-
but
yeah.
in your example of the geological, even if it's, is it still not ex parte? If it is a consultant or somebody, a geological expert that has been hired by the city to look at something, or is it that last?
That is not an ex parte contact either, because the consultant is the equivalent of a staff person.
Perfect.
But the statement is, I'm a geological expert per se, and I come in going, I know that his things are wrong. It would be wrong for me not to say something under the disclosure at the beginning, because my expertise is going to cause me to make a decision because I have evidence that no one else knows about.
Right, and there's nothing worse for me, that's exactly right, and there's nothing worse for me than during the deliberation, after the record's closed, it's all over, we're deliberating, and I say, I am a geologic expert, and I can tell you this plan is dead wrong. I know it's dead wrong, look at all these mistakes. Like, that, for me as the lawyer, is the worst case scenario, because what do? There's all this new evidence that this person has just introduced into the record that no one has an opportunity to respond to.
Well, usually, I think Gene would reopen a hearing at that point. It seems.
That's the correct way to handle it. That is the absolute correct way to handle it. But sometimes there's not time. And sometimes it's not that obvious. You know, back to bias really quickly. The threshold for bias is super high. You need to know that, because the idea is that if you're willing to serve on the planning commission, you have feelings, and you think things about where the city should go and what is good and what is bad for the city. And so the law acknowledges that you are out in the community and you're gonna think growth here is a good idea, and protection here is a good idea. And you are an active member. And so in order to show actual bias as a legal matter, LUBA is going to require statements that indicate that you cannot judge an application fairly. So when, at the end of these disclosures in the script, usually does anyone in the audience wish to question the commissioners about these disclosures? And someone gets up and does. My response to the commissioner is always, you have been challenged for bias. Do you believe that you can make a decision based on the applicable approval criteria given the evidence that is in the record? And if that answer is yes, then we move on. I mean,
You said you say that, but.
I say that.
So is this Gene actually saying this to the rest of us? No,
That's why staff
says
reads,
this to us.
staff reads the staff, that's why the staff asks us now.
Okay. So if somebody did that, you guys would ask that commissioner that question. Got it.
So barring situations where a appointed official, let's say, actively participates in a hearing to oppose a Walmart, when it came before the city before, and then they're sitting on the dais and make a decision on that same Walmart application when it comes back from LUBA. Those are the types of decisions where you have legitimate bias cases. I had a bias case in Albany where a decision maker said, I don't have to be fair about this. I mean, that was a slam dunk for me, right?
Yeah.
But usually it's not that, but my point is, everyone has biases, and it's appropriate to step down when you do have a bias and not participate, but don't be afraid to participate just because you have sometime in your life said that this wetland is worth saving? Because if you did that, we won't have any decision makers. Are we good with this? You know that, all planning commission meetings are public meetings. Public meetings occur when a majority or a quorum, which is, a majority is deliberating to a decision. That means, on city business. So if, 3 of you are sharing baking recipes, not city business, not a meeting. If you're talking about how we should change the code, it's a public meeting.
Okay, so now we're not just talking about quasi judicial. Everything up till now you've been on quasi judicial. So now we're talking about all.
Talking about all meetings, a majority of planning commissioners together discussing city business is a meeting.
So-
And a public meeting has to have an agenda, it has to have, an agenda provides notice, and it has to have minutes or reporting.
So if there's 7 of us, 4 of us is a quorum. So if 4 of us show up at the next library meeting and someone approaches us and says, hey, what do you think about the new fence code that I'm gonna put in front of you? That could be a meeting if any one of us engages. We all have to say, sorry.
Come to our next
Well,
meeting and talk about the fence
Not
code.
any one of us, one of us could probably go off to the side, because like you said earlier, with legislative, we can be out there talking to everybody. We just can't be together talking it.
So 3 of us,
3 of you could go off.
Yeah,
so we just
we'll
kick
just send
the
one.
low man to
Yeah,
the parking lot,
yeah,
whoever could.
okay.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
The important thing to know about public meetings is that all of you don't have to be in the same room. There are things called serial public meetings where, and that's the reply all scenario, right? Eric sends out the agenda to you all with the, with what's coming up. And you hit reply all and say, hey, I don't like this part of this application. I think we ought to process this as a legislative decision instead of a quasi judicial one. That creates a public meeting. So never hit reply all. But the other thing about CL meetings is that if you email one commissioner and then that commissioner emails the other commissioner and the other commissioner emails another commissioner, you may not have intended to create a CL meeting, but because it gets passed around, it creates a public meeting.
So one way to combat reply all would be to not have an email that has attendees. Or that has, people in the two or the copy, but I can imagine that would be not considered to be open. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
BCC, everything.
I don't think there would be any prohibition to that. The city knows who they send notice.
Yeah, city records would still show who they sent to.
Well, so when a commissioner calls and asks a question about an application, we've got a couple new people and they've called just to say, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do. I start writing notes and then I say, call staff, but if it's, Tuesday at 5 o'clock and the meeting's in an hour and a half and they're still confused and they got a hold of me. My cure has always been to say, we write down what was said and then disclose that. That's not the best practice, but it's the alternative to not being able to have gotten a hold of staff earlier. Any other thoughts on that?
No, the problem, Gene, is that everybody should be going through staff,
Correct.
not to you.
Yeah.
Right.
It really should, the problem is you're so good at what you do and knowledgeable that you're a resource that people find the easiest to use, but they need to go through staff.
Right.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, and I agree, but I don't wanna discourage someone to say, it's 5:30, we have a hearing in an hour and a half, and I'm lost in the weeds. you know,
Well, we can chat later
we
about.
can check later, but I'm
That's
just
the most
saying,
common, because we're looking at things after hours, as we all have day jobs. So it's like, who we call, you know, you guys are all home, which you should be, you know?
yeah, and I get it, and I'm just putting it out there to say it puts us both, the commissioner that's calling me and me in a very awkward position. To make sure that we're very clear in documenting what's being said, and I try very clearly just to answer, go look for it here or read this here, so.
Well, in my best practice, the slide that we probably won't have time for, I urge planning commissioners to not review things the day of.
Hey, so I've got a question about this, so, because now I'm hearing two different things. Because there's all the time where I've been able to talk to another counselor just one-on-one and say, hey, here are my thoughts, my concerns, all the other stuff. Right? The problem comes when I say, I'm going to have that conversation with each of the people on the council. Right? Because that's a serial meeting. But if
Correct?
I just called Gene and said, Gene, I have a question about this and I'm lost. How is that a serial meeting?
It's not a problem of a serial meeting. It's a problem of you all deliberating outside of the public meeting.
Sorry, I think the example that Gene just used, you were talking about quasi judicial,
A
right?
quasi judicial
Yeah.
hearing, not a legislative discussion that you can have with anybody.
Yeah, so I think that's an important distinction, Counselor Giles, is,
Okay.
yeah, we were talking relative to an application. Quasi judicial application.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
It is interesting, the quorum thing applies to commissioners, though. We're not elected officials. We're not the final decision maker. We're just private citizens that are part of this commission. So it's interesting that that law applies to us as well, the quorum thing. Especially if we're supposed to be out there anyway, talking to other citizens, right?
Yes, except for we need legitimacy in our decision making and land use. I mean,
Yeah.
land use works because we trust the system and everybody follows the same rules.
Very quick question.
Yeah.
A publicly noticed meeting where there isn't quorum, is your recommendation to cancel it? Or could the members who are in attendance talk about the subjects of the meeting that was noticed? And the commissioners who weren't there, they could refer to the record?
So they can't make a decision.
Right.
You need a quorum to make a decision, I expect in the charter, but there's no prohibition to them hearing testimony and taking testimony into the record.
So they could still hold the public hearing.
But they would need a quorum in a public meeting.
And then at the next meeting, the people that were absent need to acknowledge that they've
Listen
reviewed
to the hearing.
everyone gets back on the same page before the decision's made.
Public records, you know that almost any writing, data storage, or other record relating to city business is a public record. That means it can be disclosed through a public records request. And you all, I'm assuming, are issued city email accounts, and you are instructed to keep your city business separate from your private personal business. It's really important that you do that, because if the city were to get a public records request for public records that might be intermixed with your personal, we have to go through your personal computers, which is a miserable job. Especially for the attorney who has to review all the personal emails. The other thing I want to note about public records is that notes taken during a quasi judicial hearing can be public records. And so you want to be careful with making a shopping list or doodling or, you know, any kind of editorial comments that you might make in your notes, because those could be discoverable. Westland had an issue where the now mayor was in law school, filed a public records request against the city councilor. She didn't want to give up the records. Because he was in law school, he was interested in seeing how far he could push it, and he went to the Court of Appeals and got the records, so. Thanks for awkward working relationship when you're then the mayor with the same city councilor, but, it's Westland. I represent Oregon City, so it's like, like rivalry,
Oh, we have
so
a-
it's fine, you
we-
probably have the same.
We have a rivalry. I think I don't know who says it, but we are usually the number 2 safest city in Oregon behind West Lynn. And
Ah.
we think that the numbers are
Wrong.
wrong. Yeah, so we have some beef with West Lynn as well. Yeah.
So we're on the same side. All right, deliberation and decision, we talked about a number of these things already. It is the applicant's burden to show that the applicable standards and criteria are satisfied. Your job is to evaluate these 4 things. Your job is to interpret the applicable criteria. That means give meaning to ambiguous standards. Sometimes you find that meaning by using purpose statements or other context in the code itself, the definitions in the code themselves. The whole idea is to interpret the standards in a way that is consistent with how you see the intent of the standard. So if the standard is compatibility with the surrounding area, you have to decide what that surrounding area is. Is that surrounding area the house just right next door? Is it the house across the street? Is it what you can see down the block? You have to decide that, and you usually decide that using the text and the context, the purpose statements and policies intended to be furthered by the criteria. All decisions have to be supported by adequate findings. That's the explanation of how the facts satisfy the criteria. Findings have to be explanatory. They can't just be a conclusion. Findings resolve conflicts in facts and explain why one fact was deemed more reliable than another. And findings have to address all the applicable approval criteria. And if there is testimony, evidence submitted that goes either way, the findings have to address all the evidence submitted and explain why it's reliable and not reliable. And this is why staff reports are really good.
So can the staff report, so the code says, pick something easy, there's gonna be 24 parking spaces. And then the applicant's submittal in their narrative says, and here's where we counted 24. Can the staff report's response be in the staff report? So it says, here's the criteria, 24 parking spaces. Here's the applicant's response stating here are the 24 spaces. And then the finding is staff concurs with calculation. Is that a sufficient finding?
Yes, because that's a clear and objective standard.
Which is,
Which it's not what you usually have. Usually you have a standard that, let's make it more discretionary.
Mhm.
And this particular use shall have adequate off-street parking.
okay,
What is adequate? So you have to interpret what adequate means. Right? So there'll be dispute about that.
mhm,
And then you have to determine whether or not the applicant has met that determination. And adequacy usually is not just gonna be a number, it's gonna be a location, right? And it's gonna be quality and a character, it'll be in front of the building or behind the building. There could be a lot of things that go into it.
and that's good, cause we're doing industrial buildings and the applicant. The adequate parking for the industrial area based on the square footage. And so the applicant said this is adequate because we figure 70% warehousing, 30% manufacturing, so we came up with a calculation. And if in this instance, staff said, that's a great calculation, we concur. Now, as a planning commissioner, I say that's not adequate because I believe it's gonna be a 50-50 mix. And based on my whatever, that's where we should go to the staff beforehand and say to the staff, I think the calculation that the applicant's using and your agreement with
It's
that.
incorrect, because it will be a 50-50 split, because the application says they're going to put this much square footage to manufacturing and this much square footage to warehousing, and that makes up 50% of the total.
But it's all speculation, so we're just trying to buffer enough parking spaces, is the
Yeah,
good example.
yeah.
Then is it then we need to, as commissioners, before the hearing, go to the staff and say, my concern is that we're not gonna have enough parking spaces. And I would like you to understand that during the hearing, do I ask the applicant, I think you should have X because based on footprints, 50-50 is gonna generate more like 1,000 parking spaces instead of the 600 you wanna build, and I'm gonna ask staff to rewrite the findings based on my concern and how I see the development likely to occur because you haven't provided any.
Yes, but I would encourage you to ask that question in a more open-ended way to an applicant. You don't want to say, I have decided you don't have enough parking space.
Okay, yeah.
You would say, in my review, it looks to me like you are, you know, my take on this is you're more likely to have 50-50, and that requires this number of parking spaces. So could you respond to my concern? And I believe you're gonna need more parking spaces.
Okay.
And, you know, my perception that you're gonna need more parking spaces. I mean, the whole idea is for you to have a dialogue with the applicant, to give them an opportunity to solve the problem.
Mhm.
Yeah, sure, we'll do 20 more parking spaces.
Right.
We'll be happy to have a condition of approval for 20 more parking spaces. I mean, the whole idea is to have those conversations with the applicant while the record is open.
Yeah, and when I've done that before and mentioned it to staff ahead of time, I've pointed to Hugo because he's been my partner the last few applications. He also has an opportunity to say, let me make sure that the applicant is aware of this so that they can come to the meeting prepared, and that's part of. You know, we're not.
That's the benefit
I'm
of
not-
using staff as a conversation.
I'm not a sandbagger and I'm not gonna wait until they close their presentation and say, oh, by the way, I'm gonna throw this question at you. I hope that I've already preloaded all my questions, concerns through staff, through the applicant, so these questions are already out there for them.
So when it comes to evidence, you all get to decide how to weigh the evidence and make a choice when the evidence is in conflict. It might help you to know that LUBA's standard of review for for evidence is called substantial evidence, and that's whether a reasonable person looking at all the evidence could find that the standard is met. That's a super low bar.
I was gonna say that's pretty squishy.
Yeah, it's super low. It doesn't take a lot of evidence. So in other words, LUBA is going to give deference to the city's evaluation of the evidence in most cases, as long as the findings explain. Conditions of approval may be attached to ensure that all applicable approval standards are or can be met. Conditions of approval generally, unless state law says otherwise, do not have to be attached. You could deny rather than attach conditions of approval. But there are certain types of applications where if there are conditions of approval that could be attached, you have to attach them in the housing context. Okay, I'm gonna skip this slide because I know you all know about the clear and objective requirements for housing. What I will add is that we're in, you know, silly season right now at the legislature, and there are more housing bills on the horizon than I could even summarize in 3 hours. There are so many. I mean, it's like every day. I could just spend my whole life like just reviewing legislation that relates to housing and deciding, you know, how it would be implemented at the local level. I mean, it's just surprising to me that it's the local governments who have to implement all this and they're not asked. So, you know, nobody asked the city attorney what they think about how we're gonna do this.
Well, we track it and we let them know anyways, even though they don't ask.
No, I know, but it takes a lot of time, Eric, and I just,
It absolutely does. Yep. But rest assured, we're not tracking everything, but the big stuff we are tracking with our city council, and we're providing testimony.
That's not even out of committee yet, though, is it? For the most part, these bills are still.
At various stages. There's one kind of big main bill that we're tracking pretty close, the governor's housing bill. We're tracking.
We'll go back to having sessions once every 2 years instead, or less.
or 5 years. Okay, deliberation and decision. This is a lot of what we just talked about. Let's move on. conditions of approval, I said, that the conditions of approval have to be, roughly proportional to the impacts of the development. So when I come with an application for a house, a building permit for a house, the city can't condition my building permit to require me to build a library. Right? Because the impacts for my development did not demand the construction of a library. So if the city is going to impose obligations as a condition of getting a land use approval, those conditions have to be commensurate, roughly proportional with the impacts from the development. So if I'm coming with a building permit for a new house, the city could require me to build sidewalks in front of my house because I will use the sidewalks. Right? But the city couldn't require me to build 100 feet of sidewalks a mile away because I won't use those sidewalks.
What's Nolan, Dolan, and what's the last one?
Coons.
Coons, thank you.
You want to talk about all three?
No, I don't. I was having a.
Nolan, Dolan,
blip of
Coons,
what the
and
Coons
now-
last ones.
Sheets. Very good.
Yeah, that was excellent.
Nolan, Dolan, Kuntz, and Sheets, El Dorado County.
Okay, so, this most often comes up in the context of public improvements. And, I encourage, staff to reach out to me when there's concern about this so that we can be really deliberate in our drafting of the staff report. Just to give you all a jump on this issue, on these issues. Because again, this is one of those areas where we can negotiate it if we have time. And adequate findings, and opportunity to have discussions with the applicants to solve problems. Or it's to resolve their concerns would be more accurate. Okay, recommendations for effective participation, avoid ex parte contacts or evidence. If you can, if not, be aware and prepared to disclose, be attentive and prepared. It's unfair to the applicant and participants to act on issues without adequate preparation. And my suggestion to folks is to, when you get the staff report, skim it. Just skim it. Just know the general idea of what is proposed, like just take 10 minutes and just skim it. And then when you have an hour, in the following 4 days, read it. Start with the criteria and the findings. Don't start with the conditions, because the conditions won't make any sense in the abstract. Is that what you do?
I wrote down what I do
Okay.
because I,
Share, because you've
So-
got experience too.
as a planning commissioner, the first thing I do is open up the map because I want a 10,000 foot view to see where I'm at, where the project's
Sure.
located, what's next to
Yeah.
it. Then I read the applicant's executive summary so that I know what they think they're building and what they're gonna be doing and why they think it's a good project. Then I go to the neighborhood meeting notes, because that tells me what people don't already like about the project, so that when I'm reading it, I know who's gonna be testifying, who's gonna be concerned. And it gives me a head start of what might I be concerned about, because if the neighbors were already concerned about it. Then I read my agency comments, because I wanna know what my partners are already thinking about it, and if they've already given a lot of quick blessings, then it's like, okay, well, then there's not a lot of angst surrounding this project. Then I go read the staff report, and I start at the beginning and I go through that, but I wanna get my bearings of what's gonna hit me at the end before, so.
I really like the idea of reading the neighborhood comments. I often do skim the opposition testimony. When I come to an application, I usually don't come to it right at this level you do. I come later. And I often do start with the opposition testimony, so I know where to focus my attention, or I'll, call Eric and say, where's the problem gonna be?
Mhm.
I got a 95-page staff report, I can't review it, where's the problem gonna be?
Yeah, and we don't usually have opposition by the time we're reading it, so that's where I try and get.
Using
some
the
of my
neighborhood
things.
comments is a good strategy.
Yeah, so.
Others, I try to encourage planning commissioners to focus on issues and don't make assumptions about what you hear. Ask open-ended questions. Say, what I hear you saying is that correct? You know, I am reading this way. Do you agree or disagree? Do you have anything else to add? I think it's really good to have the confidence to ask questions to participants because that's your one chance. And I think that planning commissioners don't ask enough questions at that phase. And if you sit quietly and don't say anything till deliberation, then nobody knows what to do. Staff doesn't know how to prepare, an applicant doesn't know what to produce. And LUBA cases have been lost where a decision maker interpreted a standard during deliberation that nobody knew was going to be the interpretation. So try to speak up, try to engage your fellow commissioners, have a robust conversation, make it productive. Don't make up your mind beforehand. You know, you can, I urge you to have priorities. I urge you to make notes and identify areas that are of particular concern, but don't prejudge the outcome. And don't be afraid to disagree. Sharing perspectives ensures that the decision is in the city's best interest and allows for staff to write adequate findings that talk about your various views.
We hit on a couple of don't ask questions, like don't ask how much you're gonna sell it for, don't ask who the occupant's gonna be of the building. Those are some of the questions that can derail us.
Financing.
Yeah.
Your
Well, certainly, I think your obligation is to stay on the criteria and standards, right? That's your only job. And I've yet to run into a local government that has a standard and criteria that says, will this application devalue your house? Or that's property values are not something that are in further the health, safety, and welfare of a city. And you know, I would be very upfront with that during meetings. This is not a criterion standard that we can consider. And it's tough because I think there's a lot of testimony that you get from participants where they don't understand the criteria. You can say it over and over and over that decisions have to be made on the criteria. And the person will get up and say, the head of this church is the very best person and the church does so many good things. And you can't possibly deny this because this church does so many good things. And that all may be true, but you can deny it if the criteria are not satisfied. In fact, you have to, because we have to uphold the code. Okay.
Just not to harp on this too much, but on that top of that, go back. So earlier you said it's expected to have ex parte contact. Here you're saying try to avoid ex parte contact. And I think that's the route I tend to think and go is, okay, can't have any, you know, that kind of thing. But so which is it in your opinion?
Well, I think if you know it's coming towards you, avoid it. But you can't live in the world and not walk into a dinner party and hear people talking about it. In some cases, you can't, you know, you can't open the newspaper and not see an article about it. So the point is that there are unavoidable ex parte contacts, but if you can avoid it, if a constituent comes up to you and says, you know, I think this Walmart is a terrible idea, you encourage them, we're gonna talk about it at our hearing on Tuesday night. Please come to the hearing and voice your concerns. Because you're providing an education, right? The more you can educate the public about land use planning, the more comfortable they're gonna feel participating, and that's really what we want.
I had to bite my tongue during a haircut the other day. Everybody was talking about Costco.
We must be going to the same barber, Counselor Giles, because I'm not joking. I sat down the other day and I said, I didn't say who I was. I heard we're getting a Costco and another company. And I just said, where'd you hear that from?
So what over by the Thai place over by
I was
Safeway.
like, oh my gosh.
Stuff is talk of the town, right?
Yeah, Ed Sullivan, the lawyer I used to work with, who was a well-known land use lawyer, used to, whenever that used to happen, he used to go, lovely weather we're having today. And that was always, you knew that he wasn't saying anything else after that, you know, he was just, that was it.
Thank you, Carrie. What, so go
I'll do
ahead.
a little more.
Yeah,
Just
no,
one
go
more.
ahead.
Yeah, if a commissioner starts going down this track during the public hearing of things that are not quite in scope of our duties, what is the procedure and what threat does that put the decision at, you know, in terms of its,
What you might try is, you might ask the commissioner which criterion they're relying on. Can they identify which criterion that is of concern? Like let's turn this back to the criterion standards, because that's all we can make a decision on.
It seems like you could just be even more open than that and say what you said at the end. Why are you talking about that because it doesn't apply to the criterion we're using to evaluate this out?
and so we kind of look to each other as staff to kind of be like that, interesting, but no, that's not part of the.
I would hope somebody would say that to
So,
me
yeah.
if I'm going off track and
Yeah.
not pussyfoot around, just say,
Right.
you're asking and
That's it,
you're
yeah.
raising it inappropriate.
I was just trying to do it in a little nicer way.
But if that stuff's coming up, is that ground for an applicant to have a claim in an appeal? Oh, that person, they said stuff that wasn't related to this and they got stopped, but I'm pretty sure they were thinking about that when they denied me. They can't go down. Okay. Okay.
In fact, if you want to know what the legal answer is, you guys could talk about whatever you want. The findings are the thing that goes to LUBA.
Got it.
And the findings are generally drafted by the lawyers and the staff with blessing by the city planning commissioner or the city council. And that's what LUBA reviews. And it really irritates participants that what happens during the public hearing does not have to be actually reflected in the written decision. But that's what LUBA says, is that it's the written decision that is the thing. Which, when you think about decision making, if you were LUBA, you'd want it to be the written thing and not casting judgments about what happens during the planning commission meeting.
That's why the findings are the important part of this.
Right.
It's like, if we're disagree with the finding that a staff member has made. And Hugo, not that I would ever disagree with you, but if we disagree with any staff member, let's say Eric. I have to, I have to bring it up to him ahead of time to say, hey, this doesn't work. I don't agree with it, and I'm going to raise this. I can't have him change it because it's already a document that we're all in the 7-day review, but I'm gonna bring it up during the planning commission. And I think we need to change the findings because I don't agree with how the staff's interpretation of the code is. And then craft findings that support my opinion that match what the code says in that interpretation process. I would argue with you, I'm just gonna argue.
Yeah.
It's just from staff's perspective, and please, Sean and Hugo, weigh in here if you'd like. We staff, we obviously learned something tonight. We'll continue to learn and sharpen our tools as well, but we are mostly familiar with all of this and we will always work to keep us as a group. I want to say you guys, like us, the city, in line. And we will, if we start hearing comments and other things that are way off, we will politely, remind you. Because at the end of it, it's not about you or us, it's about the city making the right decision.
Yep.
So we will, chime in if we need to on really controversial applications. If we know that it's just going to be that way, we will bring Carrie on board, and Carrie will be at the hearing, or Sebastian, or both. You guys aren't going to be flying this plane, just you guys. Like, we're going to be there. We're going to be supporting you guys throughout the process. If we get into a hearing that surprises us, because people show up and all of a sudden everyone's there and it's a big deal and no one anticipated it, I just don't worry about that either. Like, that's why we do the really close look at the timeline. We can if we need, can we continue a hearing?
City staff? They can make, the planning commission. can
Planning
say.
commission can, okay, so if you guys get into, you get a whole bunch of testimony, but no one's necessarily requesting a continuance, but you guys are like, whoa. Like, we just got hammered here, and you guys need a continuance, we would do that as well, staff would then go behind the scenes. Between the two hearings, really figure out what the issues are, get a plan together for the next meeting. We're gonna be with you guys the whole way, so, don't have too many concerns that you guys are just out there and you're relatively new or something like that. We'll be, and when appropriate, we'll bring on the attorneys as well and really get this thing done the right way, so.
And we've done that before where we've had to continue it because the information was overwhelming and confusing. But it also helps staff when you say to them, and we'd like specific answers to these questions so that we task them with what we want brought back.
Does that occur during a hearing, when hearing an applicant? Where the planning commission decides we need a continuance?
That the information that was brought forward by the applicant and by the opponents or proponents became
Yeah,
too difficult to
Yeah.
decide at that time.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
It happens all the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was thinking, ideally, you'd come to that conclusion in the week before the,
No, at the
hearing, but-
hearing we had,
okay,
I'm thinking about some of the applications that were conflicting right in the middle of the
Okay.
hearing, and you're like, there's not enough.
Yeah.
There's not enough time, hours, or manpower
Can't
to
review the
absorb
evidence.
everything, and especially when you've got applicants that their testimony is 10 pages and they hand it to you and then they start talking, and you just can't
sure,
absorb it all, and it's
Yeah.
like, okay, well, we're all gonna take a recess, and that's where a little bit of, are we gonna close? Are we gonna do a 7, 7, and 7, or how are we gonna do it so that we don't get overwhelmed with more new evidence at the next hearing? So we have to, we can take in all the evidence that we want, and then you don't wanna close it, because if you have anything that happens at the next hearing and you closed it, then you're kind of putting yourself between a rock and a hard place. So you kind of wanna figure out how much more evidence are you gonna be getting? Is it going to be, are you waiting for evidence, or are you just trying to read the information that's been provided to make a decision?
And staff will triage, if you will, what's coming in, like we do that on the fly. So if someone comes to the testimony table and starts saying stuff, we're gonna know pretty quickly, and if the land use attorneys, we're gonna know pretty quickly, is this, do we need to really pay attention to this or not, frankly? And if it is, they raise some really good points, we may advise you as well to continue so we can take a look at the code. If it's something that is a smaller issue and we're comfortable, Hugo knows the code like the back of his hand now, we're gonna be able to point to the section and rebut that and help you. So we're always gonna be triaging what's coming in as well, and then sort of figuring out whether we need to continue, how robust the response needs to be, all that sort of stuff, so.
Thank you for inviting me. If you have any other questions, my contact info is right there. But you also have really knowledgeable staff, and they know the code much better than I do. So I encourage you to reach out to them too, and with any questions, comments, criticism, jokes.
Thank you. Thank you, Carrie. And I'm gonna sneak in a slightly different issue. Sebastian sent an email to you guys recently about some training for you guys. That's a new state law by the Oregon Government Ethics Commission. So basically, you guys are required to do, Trent, please jump in here if I'm misrepresenting this. You guys need to do training as an advisory board that advises or makes certain decisions. And we will be scheduling that training with this Oregon Government Ethics Commission here in Sherwood in April. So we'll invite you to that so you can check this box. It's once per term, not once a year, it's once per term. But I think we may offer it once a year if we can.
We should offer.
So it's already been set for 9 to noon. Is that the 9 to noon training that was already sent out? So I was gonna ask the question, it's 9 to noon on a Tuesday.
Right.
If,
You don't need to attend that training. Oregon Government Ethics, Commission provides training statewide. And any training they provide is open to anyone who wants to attend. This is just the city's option at a convenient location. We're also gonna provide a streaming option.
So can we watch the recorded version of your training to count for our training? That's where I was going with it, because it's
I
Tuesday,
actually
9 to
asked-
noon.
I actually asked that exact question and they told me no.
So maybe you need to get some other meeting option days and times to
Right.
circulate, so folks have some
Suggestion would
choices.
be- So the requirement is only one per term, doesn't have to be at the beginning of the term. If you're not able to make this one, I'd encourage you to reach out to Oregon Government Ethics Commission and see what other trainings they're doing that's more convenient with your schedule.
So 4 commissioners, I wrote it down, 4 commissioners' terms expire June of 2025. So do all of us have to have training prior to the expiration of our term in June of 2025? So there's 4 of us that have to have this training in the next few months.
Yeah. Let me touch base offline with Sebastian and others, see what other options there are. Yeah.
Yeah, as a volunteer, I kind of feel like, feel free to look and see what other, I'm thinking 9 to noon on a work day is pretty unacceptable.
Yeah, we'll touch base, we'll touch base offline, circle back with you guys. At a minimum tonight, just wanted to raise it, get some feedback on it, and
Thank you very much for bringing that, yeah.
Yep.
So,
The rules are extensive. And some of the new rules are frankly shocking. So this was the city's opportunity to let you know early on about the new rules and requirements. Don't want anyone to be surprised, there's actually a private cause of action for individuals, and we didn't want anyone to be surprised about the new requirements.
what's that mean?
In other words, a concerned citizen could report any counselor, for instance, who failed to meet the training, and that counselor could be fined.
Oh, okay.
we're not doing the training.
Uh,
We're not doing the
We're
training.
not doing training.
Okay. Well, let me touch base internally, figure out what options we have to get this done.
So our
Any-
training on ethics is longer than a training that we take with you on how to actually do the job. I'm reading this.
Maybe longer.
Thank you, Counselor. Thanks, Counselor Giles. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you, everybody, especially the new commissioners. We really appreciate your service in the city, and as a city council, we lean on you so heavily. So thank you.
Yep.